Willow Creek was a town of whispered secrets and quiet snowfall, nestled deep within a valley where the evergreen trees stood as silent sentinels. Every December, the town transformed into a postcard-perfect winter wonderland, its streets lined with glowing Christmas lights and the sound of carolers echoing softly through the air. But beneath the surface of holiday cheer, Willow Creek harbored its share of shadows, mysteries that lingered long after the snow had melted. At the edge of town, Abigail Clark lived in a small, unassuming cabin that seemed to have grown out of the forest itself. The house, isolated and weathered, reflected its owner, a woman retreating from a world she no longer understood. Abigail had returned from war 5 years earlier, carrying the weight of memories too heavy to share. The townsfolk saw her occasionally, stoic, solitary, and unreachable, but most knew better than to pry into her business. On a cold afternoon, Abigail was chopping firewood when she noticed the dog for the first time. He was a striking figure against the snow, a blue merle Australian shepherd with piercing eyes, one amber, the other a shade of icy blue. He stood at the edge of her clearing, watching her with an intensity that made her pause. "Go on, get out of here," Abigail called, her voice sharp. She didn't have the patience for strays. The dog didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, as if assessing her, before sitting down, his fluffy tail sweeping the snow behind him. Abigail muttered under her breath and turned back to her work, but the dog didn't leave. By the time she finished stacking the last piece of firewood, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The dog was still there. She locked eyes with him again, feeling an unfamiliar pang of unease. He didn't seem desperate or scared, just determined. "All right, but don't expect a welcome," she muttered, walking back to the cabin. She closed the door firmly behind her, peeking out the window to see if he'd finally given up. Instead, she saw him lying in the snow near her porch, his fur dusted with flakes. Abigail sighed, rubbing her temples. "You'll freeze out there," she murmured to herself. Against her better judgment, she opened the door just enough to call out, "Come in," but only until morning. The dog's ears perked up. He rose gracefully, trotting into the cabin as if he belonged there. Abigail watched him warily as he sniffed around the small living room, then curled up near the fireplace, letting out a contented sigh. She stared at him for a moment, shaking her head. "Guess you've made yourself at home." The next day, the town's annual Christmas parade took center stage. Abigail, uninterested in the festivities, stayed home. She flipped through an old book, trying to ignore the dog, Scout, as she'd begrudgingly named him. He was remarkably quiet, content to sit by the window, watching the snow fall. By late afternoon, the peace was shattered by the sound of frantic knocking. Abigail opened the door to find her neighbor, Margaret, looking pale and panicked. "Abigail, have you seen Tommy? My nephew? He was at the parade and he's gone." Abigail stiffened. "Gone? What do you mean?" Margaret's voice cracked. "We can't find him anywhere. He was holding my hand one moment, and the next, he vanished. The police are looking, but..." Abigail's stomach knotted. Memories of missions gone wrong in foreign lands resurfaced, unbidden. "I'm sure they'll find him," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Margaret nodded shakily and left, leaving Abigail staring at the snow-covered woods. Behind her, Scout let out a low whine. She turned to see him standing by the door, his ears alert and his body tense. "What's your problem now?" she muttered. Scout barked once, sharp and purposeful. He looked at her, then back at the door, then barked again. Abigail frowned. "You're not telling me you know something, are you?" Scout pawed at the door. With a sigh, Abigail grabbed her coat and boots. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but something in her gut told her to follow him. Scout bolted into the forest the moment she opened the door, his paws kicking up sprays of snow. Abigail jogged to keep up, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. Scout led her to a trail near the edge of town, where the snow was undisturbed except for a set of small footprints. Abigail crouched, examining them closely. They were fresh, too fresh. She glanced at Scout, whose tail wagged as if to say, "I told you so." Her heart raced as she followed the tracks deeper into the woods. They ended abruptly near a tree, where a single red mitten lay half buried in the snow. Abigail picked it up, her fingers trembling. She recognized it. It was Tommy's. "Scout," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog whined softly in response, his gaze fixed on her. "How did you?" The sound of a distant car horn brought her back to reality. She stood, clutching the mitten tightly. Scout barked again, urging her to keep moving, but Abigail hesitated. This was no longer a simple search for a lost child. Something darker was at play. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the snow, Abigail realized she was at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. Scout's unwavering determination pushed her forward, but a knot of dread tightened in her chest. The cold bit into Abigail's skin as she crouched beside Scout, the red mitten clutched tightly in her gloved hand. The dog's growl was low and guttural, his eyes locked on a shadowy shape beyond the trees. Abigail followed his gaze, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of something unnatural, but the shadows swallowed it whole. "Easy," she whispered to Scout, her voice steady but laced with tension. The dog quieted, though his body remained rigid. The forest around them was unnervingly silent, save for the faint whistle of wind through the branches. Abigail took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand. She pocketed the mitten and pulled her coat tighter around her. "We need to keep moving," she said, more to herself than to Scout. Scout gave her a look that felt almost human, one of understanding and urgency. Without hesitation, he led the way, his paws crunching softly against the snow. Abigail followed, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. As they walked, Abigail's mind churned. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple case of a boy wandering too far. Tommy was only 8, too young to navigate these woods alone. The mitten was a sign, but of what? A desperate plea for help? A breadcrumb trail left intentionally? Her instincts, honed from years of military service, told her there was more to this. Scout suddenly stopped, his ears twitching. He sniffed the air, then turned sharply to the right, leading Abigail off the main trail. They descended into a hollow where the snow lay deeper, untouched by the faint light of the moon. There, half buried beneath a fallen branch, was another clue. A small toy car, its bright red paint chipped and dulled. Abigail knelt, brushing snow from the toy. She remembered seeing Tommy playing with it at the parade earlier. Her fingers tightened around it as unease settled in her chest. "This doesn't make sense," she murmured. Scout barked softly, drawing her attention. He stood a few feet away, tail wagging impatiently, as if urging her to hurry. Abigail slipped the toy into her pocket and rose. "Lead the way," she said, her voice firmer now. Their search took them deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the air colder. Scout moved with purpose, his every step deliberate. Abigail couldn't help but marvel at his intelligence. It was as though he was following a map only he could see. As they climbed a small ridge, Scout paused again, his nose to the ground. Abigail saw what had caught his attention, a set of tracks leading away from the main path. They were larger than Tommy's footprints, an adult's by the look of them, and partially obscured by the snow. Her stomach twisted. Someone had been here, and recently. "Whoever you are," she muttered under her breath, "you'd better hope I don't find you." Scout growled softly, his gaze fixed on the trail. Abigail tightened her grip on the flashlight she'd brought, its weak beam slicing through the dark. She motioned for Scout to follow, and together they descended into an eerie silence. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the forest became. Abigail's thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard as a child, tales of people disappearing in these woods, never to be seen again. She'd always dismissed them as folklore, but now, trudging through the snow with Scout as her only companion, the stories felt uncomfortably real. Scout's sudden bark snapped her out of her thoughts. He was standing near a cluster of bushes, his nose pressed to the ground. Abigail approached cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the area. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, she spotted it. A piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was plaid, the the same pattern as the scarf Tommy had been wearing at the parade. Abigail's pulse quickened. "Good boy," she whispered. Reaching down to retrieve the scrap, she examined it closely, her mind racing. Scout barked again, this time louder, and Abigail turned to see him staring into the distance, his body tense. "What is it?" she asked, but Scout didn't move. He stood like a statue, his gaze locked on something she couldn't see. Abigail followed his line of sight, squinting into the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw a faint light flickering between the trees. A lantern, perhaps? Or something else. Scout barked once more and took off running, leaving Abigail no choice but to follow. "Scout!" she called, her voice sharp. The dog didn't slow down. Abigail pushed herself to keep up, her boots slipping on the icy ground. Her breath came in short bursts, visible in the freezing air. The faint light ahead grew brighter, resolving into the glow of a cabin window. Abigail stopped, her heart hammering in her chest. The cabin was old and dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside. Scout stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the cabin. Abigail approached slowly, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept strapped to her belt. "Stay close," she whispered to Scout. The cabin door creaked open, and a figure emerged. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick coat and a hat pulled low over his face. Abigail froze, her instinct screaming at her to stay hidden. The man carried a lantern in one hand and something else, something small and limp, in the other. Abigail's breath caught as she realized what it was. A child's jacket? Tommy's jacket. Scout growled low, his body coiled like a spring. Abigail placed a hand on his back, silently urging him to stay quiet. The man glanced around the clearing, his movements deliberate. He didn't seem to notice them, but Abigail knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. Her mind raced. She needed a plan, but the cold was seeping into her bones, clouding her thoughts. Scout, as if sensing her hesitation, nudged her hand with his nose. Abigail looked down at him, and in that moment, she felt a strange surge of confidence. "We'll get him back," she whispered. The man turned and disappeared back into the cabin, leaving the door ajar. Abigail clenched her fists, her jaw set. Scout wagged his tail once, as if to say, "Let's go." Abigail crouched low at the edge of the clearing, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Scout stood beside her, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the cabin. The faint sound of a child's cry drifted through the open door, slicing through the silence like a blade. Abigail's fingers tightened around the hilt of her knife as she scanned the surroundings. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, its walls weathered and splintered. But the thin plume of smoke from the chimney and the flickering light in the window told a different story. Whoever the man was, he didn't belong in Willow Creek. Or at least, not in this part of it. Abigail touched Scout's head lightly, signaling him to stay close. He gave a soft huff of understanding, his tail flicking once. Together, they crept toward the cabin, each step careful and deliberate. Snow crunched faintly beneath Abigail's boots despite her best efforts to move silently. The closer they got, the clearer the sounds became. The child's muffled sobs were interspersed with heavy, deliberate footsteps. A low murmur followed, indistinct words spoken by the man inside. Abigail's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a game of hide-and-seek gone wrong. Something darker was happening here. She reached the edge of the cabin and pressed her back against the cold wood. Scout mirrored her movement, his sharp eyes darting toward the open door. Abigail peeked inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The interior of the cabin was sparse but functional. A single lantern hung from a hook on the wall, casting uneven light across the room. The man stood near a table, his back to the door, rummaging through a satchel. On the floor near the far wall, Abigail spotted Tommy. The boy was curled up, his hands bound, his face pale and streaked with tears. He wore only a thin shirt, his jacket nowhere in sight. Abigail felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Rushing in without a plan would only make things worse. Scout's low growl brought her back to the present. The dog's body was taut, ready to spring, but Abigail placed a hand on his back, steadying him. "Not yet," she whispered. She took another careful look inside. The man was muttering to himself, his movements jerky and agitated. Abigail couldn't make out his words, but she recognized the tone. Frustration, maybe desperation. The satchel he was rifling through appeared to be stuffed with papers and what looked like old photographs. None of it made sense. Abigail reached into her pocket and pulled out the small flashlight she'd brought. She clicked it on briefly, shining the beam at Scout's feet, then flicked it off. The signal was clear. "Stay low and follow." Scout responded with a barely perceptible nod, a silent agreement between soldier and scout. They slipped around the cabin's perimeter, Abigail's knife in hand, her senses on high alert. Scout moved like a shadow beside her, his presence both reassuring and uncanny. When they reached the back of the cabin, Abigail found what she was looking for: a small, cracked window that provided a view of the other side of the room. Peering through, she saw the man more clearly now. His face was gaunt, his skin weathered and lined. His clothes were tattered, but there was something deliberate about his appearance, like he'd chosen to look this way to blend in or to be underestimated. He pulled a photograph from the satchel and stared at it for a long moment before crumpling it in his hand and throwing it to the floor. Abigail's stomach churned. This wasn't just a random act of violence. The man was looking for something, or someone. The photographs scattered across the table hinted at a connection, but Abigail couldn't make sense of it yet. Scout whined softly, drawing her attention. His ears were pinned back, his body low to the ground. Abigail followed his gaze to a second door on the side of the cabin. It was slightly ajar, a faint draft of cold air seeping through. She nodded to Scout, and they moved toward it, their steps as silent as the snow would allow. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something metallic. Blood, Abigail realized, her stomach tightening. She pushed the door open wider, careful not to let it creak. Scout slipped in ahead of her, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. They entered what appeared to be a storage room. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with tools, cans of food, and random odds and ends. Abigail spotted a heavy metal wrench on one of the shelves and grabbed it, tucking her knife into her belt. It wasn't much, but it felt solid in her hand. From the main room, the man's voice grew louder, sharper. Abigail strained to listen, picking up fragments of his words. "Not what I planned. Should have stayed hidden. Too close now." Scout let out a soft huff, drawing her attention to a small gap in the wooden wall. Abigail knelt beside him, peering through the crack. She had a clear view of Tommy now, his small body trembling as he huddled against the wall. The sight sent a pang of guilt and fury through her. She'd seen too many innocents hurt in her time, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. The man turned suddenly, pacing the room. Abigail held her breath as he moved closer to the boy. He crouched down, his face inches from Tommy's. "You'll tell me what I want to know," he hissed. "Where's the rest of it? Did they tell you?" Tommy shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know," he sobbed. "I don't know anything." Abigail felt her grip tighten on the wrench. The man's words confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just about Tommy. There was a bigger story at play, one she didn't fully understand yet. Scout growled low, and Abigail made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. Every second she hesitated put Tommy in greater danger. She motioned to Scout, signaling him to stay close, then crept toward the main room. The man's back was to her as she approached. Abigail's movements were fluid, her training kicking in as she crossed the distance silently. When she was within striking range, she raised the wrench high and brought it down with precision, aiming for the man's shoulder. The impact sent him sprawling, his lantern crashing to the floor and plunging the room into near darkness. Tommy screamed, and Scout bolted forward, his teeth bared, placing himself protectively between the boy and the man. Abigail stepped forward, wrench in hand, as the man scrambled to his feet, clutching his shoulder. "Who are you?" Abigail demanded, her voice steady but cold. "Why are you doing this?" The man glared at her, his eyes wild. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," he spat. "This isn't about you." The room was a chaotic tangle of shadows and half-light, the lantern sputtering weakly on the ground. Abigail's heart pounded as she scanned the contents of the spilled satchel. The photographs were old, their edges worn and yellowed, but the images were clear. In each one, Scout, or a dog eerily similar to him, stood beside a family she recognized. The Hendersons, who had mysteriously disappeared from Willow Creek decades ago. Scout let out a low growl, snapping Abigail back to the present. The man staggered to his feet, cradling his injured shoulder, his eyes wild with desperation. "You don't understand," he snarled, his gaze flicking between Abigail, Scout, and the photographs. "This isn't about the boy. It's about what they left behind." Abigail tightened her grip on the wrench. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "What does this have to do with Tommy? Or Scout?" The man hesitated, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to regret. "That dog," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Scout, "is the last piece of the puzzle. He belongs to them. He's been trying to lead someone back to what they hid." Abigail frowned, glancing down at the photographs again. The family looked happy: parents, 2 children, and a dog that was unmistakably Scout. But if the Hendersons had disappeared years ago, how could Scout still be here, unchanged? Her thoughts were interrupted by Tommy's soft whimper. She turned to see the boy huddled against the wall, his face pale and tear-streaked. Scout moved to his side, nudging him gently with his nose. The boy seemed to draw strength from the dog's presence, his sobs quieting as he clung to Scout's fur. Abigail's gaze hardened. "You're going to explain everything," she said to the man, her voice low and dangerous. "And you're going to do it now." The man slumped into a chair, his energy draining as quickly as the blood staining his shirt. "Fine," he muttered. "But you won't believe me." "Try me," Abigail shot back. The man let out a bitter laugh. The Hendersons weren't just any family. They were protecting something valuable. A journal, a map? I don't know exactly. But it was enough to make people want them gone. Abigail's stomach twisted. She'd heard whispers of corruption in Willow Creek's past, but she'd always dismissed them as rumors. Now, faced with the man's grim expression and the haunting photographs, she wasn't so sure. "They hid it," the man continued, "somewhere in these woods. And that dog, he knows where. He's been wandering for years, waiting for someone to follow him. But every time he gets close, someone stops him." Abigail glanced at Scout, who sat protectively beside Tommy, his eyes sharp and intelligent. She thought of how he had found the mitten, the toy car, the scarf. It was as if he'd been guiding her from the start. Before she could respond, the man lunged for the satchel. Abigail reacted instinctively, kicking it out of his reach. "You're not going anywhere," she snapped. The man let out a low growl, but he didn't move. Instead, his eyes flicked to the door. "You think you can save the boy and uncover the truth?" he spat. "You have no idea what you're up against." Abigail didn't have time to ponder his words. A sound outside, branches snapping underfoot, sent her pulse racing. She turned to Scout, who was already on alert, his ears perked and his body tense. "Stay with Tommy," she whispered to the dog. Scout didn't move, his loyalty unwavering. Abigail grabbed the satchel and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The faint glow of flashlights bobbed in the distance, accompanied by muffled voices. Reinforcements? No. The men outside didn't look like law enforcement. They moved with a predatory precision that set her teeth on edge. "They're here," the man said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You can't stop them. They want what the Hendersons left behind, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way." Abigail's mind raced. She couldn't fight off an entire group of armed men, not while protecting Tommy and Scout. But she didn't have to win. She just had to buy enough time to get them out. She turned to Tommy. "Can you walk?" she asked gently. The boy nodded, his legs trembling but steady. Abigail knelt beside him, her voice firm but calm. "You're going to follow Scout, okay? He'll take you somewhere safe. What about you?" Tommy whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "I'll be right behind you," Abigail promised, though she wasn't sure if it was a lie. "Scout, go." The dog seemed to understand the urgency. He nudged Tommy toward the side door, guiding him into the snowy forest. Abigail watched them go, her heart aching with the weight of her decision. She turned back to the man, who was watching her with a mix of pity and amusement. "You won't make it," he said. "They'll find you. And when they do—" Abigail silenced him with a single glare. "We'll see about that." The next few minutes were a blur. Abigail rigged the room as best she could, using the tools and supplies she'd found earlier. When the men burst through the door, they were met with a flash of fire and smoke as a makeshift trap sent them stumbling back. Abigail took the opportunity to slip out the side door, her boots crunching softly against the snow. She followed Scout's tracks, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The cold bit at her skin, but she pushed forward, the satchel clutched tightly against her chest. Ahead, she saw the faint glow of a lantern, Scout's beacon, leading her to safety. She caught up with them near an old clearing, where the remains of a collapsed cabin lay buried beneath years of snow and ice. Scout was digging frantically at the base of a tree, his paws uncovering something hidden beneath the roots. Tommy stood beside him, shivering but alive. Abigail knelt beside Scout, her hands trembling as she helped him clear the dirt and snow. Together, they unearthed a small metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. Abigail opened it carefully, her breath catching as she saw its contents. A leather-bound journal, a faded map, and a bundle of old letters. The truth. Before she could process what she'd found, the sound of voices reached her ears. The men were closing in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Abigail stood, her jaw set. "Scout, take Tommy and run," she ordered. The dog hesitated, his gaze locking with hers. For a moment, she thought he might refuse. Then, with a soft whine, he nudged Tommy forward, guiding him into the safety of the trees. Abigail turned to face the approaching men, the satchel in one hand and her knife in the other. She didn't expect to survive, but she was determined to give Scout and Tommy a chance. The confrontation was brutal, but Abigail's training kept her one step ahead. By the time reinforcements from Willow Creek arrived, alerted by Tommy, who had reached safety with Scout, Abigail was battered but alive. The journal and map revealed the truth about the Hendersons and the secrets they had been protecting. Scout's role as their silent guardian became clear, his extraordinary intelligence and loyalty finally understood. In the days that followed, Abigail found herself drawn back into the world she had avoided for so long. She adopted Scout officially, their bond deepened by the trials they had faced. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, one forged in the snowy woods of Willow Creek. On Christmas morning, as the town celebrated, Abigail stood at the edge of the forest with Scout by her side. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined her. In Scout's unwavering gaze, she saw hope, resilience, and a reminder of the miracles that could arise from even the darkest of nights. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.